What if the bloodiest woman in history never spilled a single drop? You've heard the name, or at least the legend. The Blood Countess. The noblewoman who bathed in virgin blood, who slaughtered girls just to stay beautiful. Elizabeth Bathory, the most prolific female killer the world has ever known. But what if we've been wrong? For over 400 years, what if the story that haunted generations was crafted by her enemies? Because behind the myth was a real woman, born into power, educated, commanding, and to the men around her, dangerous. She may not have been a murderer, but she was a threat. This isn't just a horror story. It's a warning about what happens when a woman steps outside the roles history wrote for her. So buckle in, because Elizabeth Bathory isn't just a monster from the past. She's a mirror, and what we see in her reflection might be darker than anything she was ever accused of. She wasn't just born into nobility. Elizabeth Bathory was born into power. Real bloodline deep power. Her family tree twisted through kings and warlords. Her cousins wore crowns. Her childhood homes? Not one, but many. Winter in Countess, spring in Vienna, summer in estates most people couldn't dream of. But here's where things get interesting. While most noble girls were raised to be quiet, decorative, and obedient, Elizabeth read. She studied the stars, medicine, politics, languages. By her teens, she could hold court in Latin, German, Hungarian, and Slovak. While other girls stitched embroidery hoops, Elizabeth stitched together a mind sharper than any blade, and she didn't keep that brilliance locked away in a tower. She treated sick peasants with herbal remedies, stepping in where doctors failed or didn't bother. Think about that. A teenage noblewoman, elbow-deep in poultices and plagues, healing the poor when the system wouldn't. But here's the part history doesn't like to talk about. A powerful woman who doesn't play by the rules. That's not just rare, it's threatening. When a man wields power, he's a genius, a general, a statesman. When a woman does the same, she's unnatural, dangerous, a seductress, a schemer, a monster, and in Bathory's case, a vampire. But when you look at her early years, you don't see a villain forming. You see a protagonist standing her ground in a rigged world. Her story doesn't start as horror. It starts as tragedy, a Shakespearean arc. A gifted young woman, born into greatness, cursed by the time she lived in. But like all great tragedies, there's always a turn. A moment when everything begins to unravel. And for Elizabeth Bathory, that moment was closer than anyone knew. It always starts with whispers. First, it was just strange tales. Vanished servant girls, screams in the dark. Then, it escalated. Torture chambers beneath Countess Castle. A countess bathing in blood to stay young. You know the story. It's gothic, grotesque, cinematic. But horror stories rarely ask who started the tale and who had something to gain. Because Elizabeth Bathory didn't exist in a vacuum. She had enemies, powerful ones. After her husband, Count Nadasti, died in 1604, Elizabeth didn't fade quietly into mourning. She rose. She ran estates, collected taxes, controlled key territories and castles, and that made her a problem, not for what she did, but for who she was doing it as, a wealthy, unmarried woman, wielding power in 17th century Hungary. Now ask yourself, what's easier, paying back a mountain of debt to a noble widow, or destroying her so thoroughly? You never have to pay her a single coin, because in 1610, the accusations began, and they didn't start small. Not one or two deaths, not a few servants, 276 girls, murdered, drained of blood, rituals, sorcery, the full horror catalog. Sounds outrageous. It should, because it might be. Here's what most retellings. The investigation was led by Georgi Thurzo, A man appointed by King Matthias II. A man who owed his career to the king. A man with every reason to give the crown exactly what it wanted. And when Bathory was arrested, the king cancelled her debts. Wiped clean. No repayment. No restitution. Just a silence. And no trial. No defense. No public testimony. Just a story. One so monstrous, so blood-soaked, that no one questioned it. Because once you make someone a monster, you don't owe them justice. You don't even owe them truth. All you have to do is make sure your version of the tale gets told first. What do you think? Was this justice or a setup? Let's tear into the legend. The infamous virgin blood baths. The scene recreated in horror films, goth art, and vampire lore for centuries. There's not a single contemporary record of it. Not one. That now iconic detail. It didn't appear until more than 100 years after Bathory was dead. It was folklore, gossip around a fire, gothic fan fiction, before fan fiction was even a thing. But like any sensational lie, it stuck. Because stories soaked in blood are harder to forget than those grounded in truth. So where did the horror actually come from? From confessions, pulled from Elizabeth's own servants. And how did they get those confessions? Through torture. One servant had her fingers ripped off before she confessed. Another described rituals and murders. After hours of beatings, the pain was the script. They just read the lines. And the trial, if you can even call it that, it was held in secret. Elizabeth wasn't even allowed in the room. No testimony, no defense, no voice. Some of the accusations were wildly contradictory, some flat out impossible. But none of that mattered. The ending had already been written, etched in wax, approved by the crown. Because here's the truth behind the truth. Elizabeth Bathory's legacy was never hers to shape. It was engineered, crafted by men who saw a rich, landowning woman with power, and decided she couldn't be allowed to keep it. And the cruelest twist, she isn't remembered despite the myth. She's remembered because of it. She became the bedtime story, the warning. A monster used to whisper, "Don't let women get too powerful. Don't let them age with dignity. Don't let them rule alone." That's why Bathory still haunts us, not as a person, but as a mirror, reflecting our oldest fears. And maybe that's the real horror. Let's take a breath. Step back from the gore, the headlines, the folklore. Forget the courtroom whispers and the horror tropes. Let's look at the arc, not of a villain, but of a character. A real woman, who lived, who ruled, who unraveled. This isn't the story of a monster. It's the story of how monsters are made. A girl born into privilege, but not emptiness. She studied, questioned, strategized. She traded embroidery needles for books. She grew into a woman who didn't just survive marriage, she mastered it. A widow left behind with lands to manage, taxes to collect, enemies to outmaneuver. She ruled, and for that, they turned on her. Was she strict? Maybe. Cold? Possibly. Was she the immortal vampire who bathed in virgin blood? That part's harder to prove. And maybe that's exactly why it stuck. Because somewhere along the way, Elizabeth lost control of her own story. One whisper at a time. One rumor. One accusation. Until she wasn't Elizabeth anymore. Not a woman, not even human. Just a warning label. A cautionary tale with fangs. Hung like a noose over every powerful woman that came after. And here's the part that cuts deepest. What happens when a real woman becomes a ghost story? She's not remembered for her mind, or her rulership, or her fire. She's remembered for what she threatened. Power without permission. Knowledge without a leash. A woman who didn't ask before taking the throne. That's not a monster. That's a mirror. And maybe that's the real fear we've been hiding behind all along. Elizabeth Bathory never really died. She just changed form. Metal bands write songs in her name. Gamers slay her pixelated double. TV shows crown her the queen of nightmares, wrapped in lace, lipstick, and screams. She's the blueprint for female evil, the ultimate femme fatale, the woman who bled virgins to cheat death, cold, vain, violent. But maybe, just maybe, we keep telling her story for a different reason. Maybe we whisper her name, because she still makes us uncomfortable. Because Bathory isn't just a castle-dwelling ghoul, she's a symbol of rage, of power, of ambition that refuses to bow. No husband, no church, no crown, just her. And that kind of woman, in any century, terrifies people. Because if she wasn't the monster, if the legends were lies, then maybe the real monsters were the ones who told the story. Maybe it's easier to believe she bathed in blood than admit history bathed her in betrayal. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just a legend. She was a lens, a prism that still reflects one unsettling truth. What do we do with a woman who holds power we can't control? Do we celebrate her strength, or do we twist her into something monstrous and call that justice? Because maybe the real horror isn't what she allegedly did. It's what we needed her to become. We needed a villain. We needed a warning. We needed a story to remind the world. This is what happens when a woman refuses to stay small. So now it's your turn. Was Elizabeth Bathory a monster of her own making, or a mirror held up to the fears of her time? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk, debate, unpack the myth together. And if this story chilled you, challenged you, or cracked something open, tap that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell, because here, we don't just tell stories, we pull back the curtain and ask what's hiding behind the myth.